Hello, government students. It's about 7:03, so I'm gonna go ahead and jump in. I'm alone. If people come in, that's just fine. They'll just be listening to me talk. So I'm gonna share my screen. We are recording. We should be good to go. Okay, I'm gonna pull this up here. Okay, so for tonight's session, I am gonna go over in your packet in the very back, there should be, I think it's on page 35, starting on page 35, there should be the top 10 acts of Congress. And then immediately following that, there should be like a this versus that section. And I'm going to go through the first 10 of those tonight as well. And then on Thursday night, I'll do another Zoom meeting at 7 again. And I'll finish those up. I think there's like 40 total. So I'll do a lot on Thursday night. So let's go ahead and just jump into the top 10 acts of Congress. And for my kids, we have gone through some of these before in class, actually just last week. So it might be a little bit of review for you. But the first one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is probably arguably the most important piece of legislation Congress has ever passed. It basically prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It forbade discrimination on the basis of sex, as well as race in hiring, promoting, and firing. So this is what kind of protects all of those, minority groups from any kind of discrimination in a variety of different areas. And as we know by the date, this was, in the middle of the civil rights movement, and it was passed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. This is something that, if for some reason on the AP exam, you have to reference, maybe in an FRQ, you can reference the letter from Birmingham jail. This would be maybe something that you can use to make a nice connection with. I'm just kind of thinking if it's an argument essay. In the argument essay, you don't have to use the documents they give you. You can, if they give you letter from Birmingham jail, or even if they don't, you can always reference something that you know of outside of what they're giving you to make connections with it in your argument. So this might be something really good to keep in your back pocket. The next one then is kind of connects. It's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Again, this was signed by Lyndon Johnson into law, and it outlaws discriminatory voting practices that were adopted in a lot of those southern states. After the Civil War, after the 15th Amendment is passed, that gives voting rights to African American men. We still see a bunch of practices that are going on, especially in the southern parts of the United States, that are limiting not just African American men, but African Americans in general, from being able to exercise their right to vote. So it makes things like literacy tests and white primaries and the grandfather clauses, they are all illegal after the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. Well, that's about it. I think that's probably good for that one. I'm going to go ahead and keep moving on. The next one is the Clean Air Act of 1970, and this was signed by Richard Nixon, and it enacts, it results in a major shift in federal government's role in air pollution control. So this is what kind of legally authorizes Congress and really the bureaucracies to start implementing regulations on different companies and different corporations when it comes to emissions that they're putting into the environment. And it says that it limits emissions from both stationary, which would be like industrial areas, and sources like mobile sources, so cars, trucks, planes, trains, any kind of vehicles like that as well. Okay. The next one is the War Powers Resolution, and we've definitely talked about this in class. It was passed in 73, and again, this was under Richard Nixon, although this is one example of something that was vetoed by a president that was overridden by Congress. So this was kind of in the heart of the Vietnam War, it had kind of come to light the United States' involvement, and really how maybe the United States wasn't being super truthful about what was going on military-wise in Vietnam, and some military practices were maybe considered a little unsavory. And so Congress tries to kind of react with that, and they issue the War Powers Resolution. And it's a federal law that's intended to check the president's power to commit armed forces to different foreign areas. And some specifics of this legislation is that it requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action, and it forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days without congressional authorization for use of military force. So this is kind of, as we know in the Constitution, there's a little bit of a conflict. The president is given the formal power as commander-in-chief, but Congress is who officially declares war. So that creates a little bit of conflict between the two branches in that regard. And, you know, for obvious reasons, Richard Nixon did not want to sign off on this, limiting the president's power, not just his, but in general, the president's power when it comes to, you know, how much military action he can take. So again, this was vetoed, but it was overridden by Congress. Okay, Budget and Impoundment Control Act of '74. Basically what this does, and I don't know that you're going to actually see this on the test anywhere, but it might be good just to go over it. It establishes a new congressional budget process, and it literally sets up the committees in both the House and the Senate on the budget. So the committees on the budget, this is what actually creates those in the House and the Senate. It also sets up the Congressional Budget Office, which is one of those offices that is super important for kind of like the function of the federal government nowadays. This is an office that the president works very closely with. And it established a procedure providing congressional control over the impoundment of funds by the executive branch. Okay, can keep going here. The next one then is the Federal Election Campaign Act of '74. We talked about this for sure. We went over this when we talked about the Citizens United court case, the very last one that's required. And what this does is set limits on contributions by individuals, political parties, and PACs. The 1974 amendments also established an independent agency, the FEC. So that's a really important part of it, is that it actually sets up, it not only limits things, right? It puts restrictions on campaign contributions, but it also sets up the Federal Election Commission, which is that government entity that oversees basically elections, how they're financed, and they're the ones who kind of establish all these different laws in regard to that. Some specifics for this one: it limited contributions in federal elections, it required substantial disclosure of campaign financial activity, and it created an independent agency to administer and enforce these provisions, which was the FEC. Okay, moving right along. The ADA, another very big piece of legislation that was passed by Congress. I mean, all of these are, but this was huge. And this was passed in 1990. And it's a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, all public and private places that are open to general public. So this required a really large shift in the country in regards to like hiring practices, promotions, training, pay, all of that kind of stuff. It now makes it illegal for employers to basically in any way, shape, or form discriminate against someone that has a disability, and it requires employers to really go above and beyond to try to provide that employee, if an employee has a disability, they have to try to provide that employee with resources that will allow them to do their job at the same level or rate as someone without a disability in the same position. And then this is also what requires, all, let's say, state governments are required to put all like handicap accessible ramps and restrooms and parking spaces in any kind of public areas. And so this was pretty big. It restricts questions that can be asked about an applicant's disability before a job offer is made. It requires that employers make reasonable accommodations to the known physical or mental limitations of otherwise qualified individuals with disabilities, unless it results in undue hardship. So it's kind of like what I touched on already. But this was big, and it was kind of like one of those big sweeping pieces of legislation. Okay, the next one's the Welfare Reform Act, and this was from the 70s again, 1976. And what this does is grant states kind of greater latitude in administering social welfare programs. What it really does is basically cut the number of individuals that would be receiving welfare after this is passed. So it puts requirements on people who are receiving welfare benefits. It puts almost stricter requirements before you can receive welfare. It included a 5-year lifetime limit on the benefits. So you can only have up to 5 years of welfare benefits as an individual, you know, coming from the government. And again, what it really does is kind of dramatically creates a dramatic decline in the number of people that are receiving welfare benefits at this time. Okay, that brings us to No Child Left Behind, which I know I touched on a little bit in class when I was reviewing for this last week. This was from 2001. This was under George Bush Jr. And this was kind of a time period where the United States sort of had like a panic moment, and you know, we were starting to look at where our students in the United States stood in regards to like math and science in comparison to students in countries around the world, like, you know, Japan and China, etc. And it looked as if we were falling very far behind of these other countries. And so the you know, United States government said, okay, we need to step in and do something about it. And what it does is require states to do standardized tests in reading and in math from grades 3 to 8, and then at least once in high school. And it said that schools must report on the performance of different groups of students. So schools are required to report on, you know, how African Americans kids score in comparison to white students, in comparison to students that maybe have a disability or on IEPs, and as well as the student population as a whole. So the school in general just has data behind, you know, with these test scores. And then they're going to look at those and they're going to compare those to other schools in the area, and then other schools in the state, and then other schools in the country. And what we were looking for was proficiency. So we would set a number and we would say, this is proficient, and every student needs to hit this specific number in all of these different areas. And the problem here was that the proficiency standard pretty much created an all or nothing definition of academic performance. So it was basically like, you know, even a student who, you know, maybe has certain disabilities that require them additional resources to get them on the same level as other kids that don't have certain disabilities for testing purposes, they were still put into that overall score average. And, you know, that's like testing an elephant and a monkey on who can climb a tree better. And so there was major issues with No Child Left Behind. And like it says here, schools were penalized if a student fell short of the proficiency bar, but they didn't get any like extra credit or extra points if kids scored well above the proficiency mark. So there were lots of flaws in this. Eventually, No Child Left Behind is replaced by an act called Every Student Succeeds, and that was in 2015 under President Obama. And it just kind of makes adjustments to the No Child Left Behind plan. Okay, then that takes us to the USA Patriot Act, which we definitely talked about in class. And this is one of those that, honestly, it's one of those that kind of, I don't know, lessens or kind of takes away or gives less protection to our Fourth Amendment rights. Not ours, but some people in the United States, their Fourth Amendment rights, because what it did is basically allowed the federal government to, if they suspected someone of being a terrorist, because obviously this is after 9/11, they kind of were open and free to use these different tactics to kind of spy on people, whether it was tapping their phone or their house or whatever it might be. And so a lot of people after the fact kind of argued that this act is an infringement on our Fourth Amendment rights, you know, protection from unreasonable search and seizure. And so again, this is passed after 9/11, and it punishes terrorist attacks in the United States and abroad through enhanced law enforcement and strengthened money laundering prevention. It also allowed the use of investigative tools designed for organized crime and drug trafficking prevention for terrorism investigation. So again, that would be like wiretapping phones and stuff like that. And the actual USA Patriot Act is an acronym. It stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept obstruct terrorism. Okay, those were the top 10 acts of Congress as we see it to be important. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to see how many participants. Still just me. Nobody's joining me. That's okay. So now I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Okay, and now we're going to go through those first 10, this versus that. Okay, the first one is nomination versus general election, and this is in regards to like presidential elections, primaries versus the general. So if we're talking about nomination, first someone has to go through the primary process, and remember, primary elections happen in the springtime before any general election. So usually like February, March, April. And this is where we hold either primaries or caucuses that will narrow down the candidate field for each of the two major parties. The official party nomination comes at the convention in the summer before the election. And again, both the Democrats, the two major parties, the Democrats and Republicans both have party conventions, and this is where someone is officially offered a nomination and they officially accept that nomination. And again, it's, you have to make it through the primary process, which narrows down the candidate field. If you paid attention at all, in 2020, the original candidate pool was almost 30 people. And so as we get closer to the election and we get through the primaries, people start dropping out, the less support they have. And then that's when we make it to about, late May, early June, and we kind of know it was going to be Joe Biden. But he officially was offered that nomination at the party's convention, which I want to say was like in late July, maybe early August. And then on the other side, it's general election. And this is where most of the time, the two major contenders are the two major party candidates, a Republican and a Democrat. Third party candidates are also kind of thrown in there as well, though they don't get a very large portion of the vote. And we know that in the general election, although we take a popular vote in November, the person who wins the electoral vote to have 270 or more is the person who will win the actual presidential election. So then that brings us to primaries and caucuses themselves. And again, primaries are those and caucuses are those like pre-election elections. And what they just do is basically narrow down the candidate field for each of the two major parties. Primaries are run by state and local governments. So if I'm going to vote in a primary, I get a voter card just like I would for a regular presidential election. And I go to the polls and I vote. They ask me in Missouri, they ask if you want a Republican or Democratic ballot. You tell them, and then you vote for who you want. It is a secret ballot, and there are open or closed primaries. In Missouri, like I just said, it's kind of a mix. It's not fully open, but it's not really closed either. This just depends on the state. We'll talk about open versus closed, I think, on the next slide. But caucuses are much different. They are honestly a little antiquated. Only really a certain person, someone who's very into politics or very much passionate about their political ideology, are going to be the ones who show up to caucuses. But they're private meetings run by political parties. They're usually held at the county, district, or precinct level. And so, guys, a lot of time these caucuses are literally held in like elementary school gyms and cafeterias. Iowa hosts the first caucus. It's, you know, very big for all candidates because if they can win Iowa, you know, their name's out there first, and it gives them a little bit of momentum. But I think Iowa has something like 200 caucus locations throughout the state, and literally they're like in school gyms and stuff like that. So in a caucus, participants divide themselves into groups according to the candidate they support. And at the end of the night, the number of voters in each group determines how many delegates each candidate has won. So literally, you know, if there's 5 different groups of people, they just count how many people are in each candidate's group, and that's the amount of electorates delegates that candidate will get. So it's a little funky, but there are several states that do it that way. Okay. Now, open primaries versus closed primaries. Like I said, Missouri is kind of a mix of these two. In open primaries, though, anybody eligible to vote can go in and use a secret ballot to vote the way that they want to. There is no can vote for candidate in their party, or they may choose. So there is no, like in Missouri, they make you choose a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot. In open primary states, everyone is on the same ballot and you can choose whoever you want. Open primaries also allow independent and third-party voters to participate in primaries without registering with the party. So you can literally just, there's ways to just make sure your name is added to a ballot if you're someone who is wanting to run. Closed primaries, though, usually happen in states, I believe Illinois has closed primaries. This is where you have to be a registered voter, but also you have to register with a particular political party before you can participate in these primaries. So it forces voters to affiliate with a political party before they can vote in a primary, and therefore independent and non-affiliated voters are generally forced to affiliate with either Republican or the Democratic parties to cast their vote in a primary election. And again, it just depends on the state with the open and closed. Okay, then that takes us to conservative versus liberal. We'll start with liberal on the left. If someone is liberal, or if something is more liberal, they tend to believe in governmental action to achieve equal opportunity and equality for all. So when we talk about big government, you know, we talk about government needing to be involved in a lot of areas to ensure that, you know, everyone has equal opportunity and that there's equality for all throughout the country. Liberals tend to believe that the duty of government is to protect civil liberties and individual human rights. Liberals fall on the left side of the political spectrum, and most of the time, if someone's liberal, they will identify as a Democrat. On the other side of things, then, when it comes to conservatism, conservatives tend to believe in personal responsibility and limited government as opposed to government involvement. You know, they would prefer smaller government and, you know, individual, you know, ruggedness, making your own way in the world, not relying on the government for certain things. They tend to believe in free markets, right? So very little, if any, government involvement or regulation in the economy. They believe in individual liberties, traditional American values, very strong national defense, and conservatives fall on the right side of the political spectrum, and a lot of the times they're going to identify as Republicans. Okay, and then that brings us to Republican versus Democrat. We'll start with Democrats. Again, Democrats prefer big government, so lots of government involvement, not just in the economy, but, you know, regulations in the environment, etc. And, you know, that is the idea behind that is, you know, if you leave it up to the states, sometimes the states aren't doing the right thing. We saw that with like during the civil rights movement, for instance, states weren't necessarily allowing African Americans the right to vote, or allowing African Americans, equal rights in general. And so the idea here with big government is that the federal government had to step in and create, something like the Civil Rights Act to try to, create equality for all throughout the country. If continue here, Democrats tend to favor gun regulations. They would support Roe v. Wade. So, the existing policy that we hold in the United States on abortion, keeping it legal, at least in some ways. They tend to favor progressive taxes, so they would prefer the rich or the more wealthy people in society to pay more taxes. They would prefer government regulations on the environment and the economy, just to ensure that they're supporting consumers. And then decrease in military spending, and not as much because they don't believe in national security, but it would be more like Democrats would tend to think that if we spend so much on national defense and national security right now, we could take some of that money and use it in other ways, in other areas that would maybe be more beneficial, or at least that's the thought behind it. Republicans, on the other hand, prefer small government. They would like states to be able to have a little bit more say when it comes to decisions for their own states, as opposed to having to follow big government regulations. They support the Second Amendment. They would like to see Roe v. Wade overturned to make abortion illegal. And they support, hopefully this kind of rings a bell, supply side economics. So that's the idea that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, the rich, the big corporations, that ideally that money then will trickle down into the rest of the economy. So if we're cutting the taxes for Amazon, ideally they pay their workers more, which allows for a continued stimulation of the economy, because if people have more money in their pocket, they tend to spend more money. They would be completely against government regulation of the economy. So I think in the last slide, we talked about how conservatives prefer free market. So very little government involvement or regulation of economic issues. And then they would like, conservatives or Republicans prefer maintaining, at least maintaining, if not increasing, military spending. And a lot of the times they would describe that as using or gaining peace through strength. So if we spend enough, if we spend a lot on our military, we ensure peace because we have such a strong military out there. Okay, we'll keep going here. Major versus third parties. Okay, so we know the two major parties are the Democrats and the Republicans, and there has been a Democrat or Republican that has won every presidential election since Lincoln, 1865. And well, it was probably before that. It was probably Lincoln's first election. Anyway, major parties cast a very broad net, meaning, in comparison to, third parties can get more specific in their platforms and what planks they decide to focus on. The two major parties have to be very broad in their ideology, although sometimes you think about it, you think, no, there's no way that's broad. But yes, in general, they both have very broad platforms, and that is because of the two-party system, they have to be able to attract as many voters as possible. So if they were getting very specific on certain issues, they would lose voters. So the Republicans and the Democrats have to keep things very broad. They have to cast a very broad net to ensure that they have as many voters as possible. On the other hand, with third parties, obviously they rarely win elections in the United States. They frequently influence national politics by drawing attention to issues previously neglected by major parties. That's a big kind of role that third parties play. They can kind of draw attention to things that maybe the two major parties just don't seem to care about. I would give you the example of like the Green Party. They are very much focused on environmental issues, environmental regulations, cutting down emissions. And so just having the Green Party there and focusing on this issues has kind of made the other two major parties go, oh, okay, this is important. We might want to kind of gear our platform or maybe our planks in this direction as well. The other thing about third parties is when someone is a popular third party candidate, although they don't win presidential elections, what they end up doing is pulling voters from one of those two major parties. And so our good example here is going to be Teddy Roosevelt in the 1912 election. He creates the Bull Moose Party. So he had already been the president for 2 terms. He takes 1 term off. He decides to run again, but the Republican nomination was not available. So he creates the Bull Moose Party. And what that ends up doing is it's Taft, Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson running in the election. And what Roosevelt ends up doing is just pulls votes from Taft, which is the Republican candidate, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, ends up winning. And so really that's what third party candidates end up doing, is just pulling votes from the other two major parties. All right. Government realignment versus de-alignment. So realignment is going to be a sharp change in political ideology, issues, party leaders, regional and demographic bases of power of political parties, and the structure of rules of the political system. So throughout history, we've seen these really critical, what we would call critical elections, that kind of gives us an idea of what realignment really looked like. And so one of those elections was the first election of FDR during the Great Depression. Hoover was the president before him. Hoover was very disliked. He was not a popular president by any means. And so when Franklin Roosevelt runs, he runs on a very progressive platform. He runs on the not the Green New Deal, on the New Deal. And so he, promises to create all of these public works, all these jobs, helping the economy, et cetera. And so this is one of those times where we kind of see a little bit of a party realignment where, prior to this, most of the country is what we would consider Republican. And then with the kind of changing of ideologies that happens during this time period, we now, pull out of the Great Depression, and most of the country is now what we would consider Democrats at the time. And then on the opposite side of that is de-alignment, and this is the trend or process whereby a large portion of the electorate abandons its previous partisan or political party affiliation without developing a new one to replace it. So if a party becomes very unpopular and people are fleeing the party, that's going to be like a de-alignment. Okay, so you could argue that way back in the day with like the Whigs or the Federalists or whatever it might be, that would be party de-alignment. All right, we're almost done here. This next one is reapportionment versus redistricting. Very, very easy. So after the census is taken every 10 years and we get a good idea of the population count in each of the states, first we're going to reapportion. So that means we're going to have to adjust the seats in the House of Representatives for each state, depending on if that state increases or decreases in population. So it's April 26th right now, 2021, and just today, the census data from 2020, the 2020 census came out, and they gave us just a very brief overview of which states will gain seats and which states will lose seats. Texas gained 1, Florida gained 1, I think North Carolina, Colorado, Oregon gained 1, Illinois lost, Pennsylvania lost. There were a couple others that lost as well. But anyway, we will get census data every 10 years, and then we'll readjust the seats in the House of Representatives. Because remember, 435 always stays the same. That will not change. What we have to do, though, is just adjust the seats that each state has. Actually, California lost 1, now that I'm thinking about it. So instead of 53 members in the House, moving forward, California will only have 52 members in the House. Okay, and then redistricting comes after we reapportion. So once we know how many seats each state's going to get in Congress or in the House of Representatives, then that is when the redrawing of those congressional district lines will happen. And remember, it's the state lawmakers that are in charge of drawing those district lines for their own state. And that's kind of where gerrymandering comes into play. Okay. Political parties versus interest groups. Guys, the biggest difference between these two is that political parties work to get people elected to office. Interest groups do not, okay? They both are made up of people with common interests and beliefs. They both work to influence laws and policies. The only big difference here is that political parties work to get politicians elected. Interest groups do not necessarily do that. Examples, we know Democrats and Republicans are the two big examples for political parties. Some interest group examples would be like the National Rifle Association, the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired People. Sorry, I had to think about it for a second. Another example would be like, I use this in class, the NEA, the National Education Association. It is the labor union for educators, okay? That one's easy. All right, last one. Activism versus restraint. Judicial activism versus judicial restraint. Judicial activism is when it's, judges, not necessarily Supreme Court, but even just federal judges in general, make decisions that would create sweeping policy changes throughout the country. So this would be breaking from precedent. An example of this might be when they decided on Brown versus the Board of Education. So they completely overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, which says that separate is equal. And when they decide Brown versus the board, this creates sweeping policy changes for the entire country. So the judges that were in the majority in that decision were definitely using judicial activism. And this is going to be based on the personal or political kind of judgment or viewpoint of a judge rather than existing legislation, which is exactly how, Brown versus the board, we can fit that right into that because, at the time in the country in the 1950s, it was still law that separate facilities for whites and blacks was completely legal. So these judges had to look at this case and go, okay, something's wrong here. We need to break from precedent on this, which is using judicial activism. Okay, judicial restraint, on the other hand, when judges use stare decisis, let the decision stand, they're using restraint. And judges will use restraint when they are hesitant to strike down existing laws. So some judges just literally believe that some things, depending on what kind of general topic the case falls under, some things should be left to the legislative branch, and that they don't want to create new legislation or new policies by their decision that they're making in the federal courts. So if they kind of stick with precedent or stick with prior decisions and how they were made, they're going to use judicial restraint. Okay, that is all I have for you tonight. That was a nice short 40 minutes. I hope this was helpful. Please feel free to join me on Thursday so I don't feel alone. If you have any questions, you can ask me at that point, okay? All right, thank you, goodbye.